ideas challenge you,
Mm.
when you're trying to look at something and go, hang on, that's not how I was told the story. That's not how I was told to accept this people group for this reason.
Mm.
What is How do I embrace the possibility of that in a context that is going to be so disruptive to the worldview that I've grown up in, or so disruptive to the the frame in which I have traditionally seen the world in? And do I have enough humility to enter that discussion with a well, what if scenario?
Hey there, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Justice Matters. I'm your host, Tim, and today on the episode, we have a dear friend, a good mate. His name is Mark Reddy. Now, Mark serves as the co-founder and the sitting chair of Chasing Justice. Now, this is a movement designed to mobilize people of faith to follow Jesus and to live justly. Alongside his wife, Vicky, they moved to the USA 5 years ago. They now live in Chicago. Well, they got involved with a conference that they started to spearhead called the Justice Conference. It has now since spread out to Australia here. It's been running for 5 years. And Mark has served along in many agencies, many non-government agencies and charities and churches, including World Vision, World Relief, Compassion, and so many more. And he's really dedicated his life to empowering people, especially those that are marginalized, in elevating their voices. And I think you're going to find in my conversation with him, as he speaks in particular to issues of racial injustice that we see so prevalent today, and the important work that Chasing Justice is doing. You're going to learn so much. I learn so much every time I talk with him. And in particular, this conversation, I just went away from it thinking, whoa, I've got a lot more learning to do. But I was just so encouraged and so inspired that he is out there leading such important work. You're really going to enjoy this episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Cheers. Well, Mark, what can I say? It's thank you so much for carving out some time. It's good to see you again. I think the
Good to
last
see you,
time
mate.
the last time I saw you was in your home in Chicago. I think I had a layover and I was able to sneak my way over to your place. And I think the next day you were flying out overseas yourself. So I felt lucky to get you.
Yeah, well, I think was that in the middle of winter in Chicago? I can't remember. It felt like it was cold.
It was pretty cold. I don't think I had probably a full heavy jacket, so it can't have been dead in the middle of winter, because I know that place just is brutal. But you're not in Chicago at the moment. Hey, you're out on the West Coast.
I'm on the West Coast. I'm in San Francisco, enjoying a couple of weeks here, visiting my sister
Yeah.
and her two little baby. So I'm trying to escape COVID and do all the things the right way, but still get some family time in.
Right. Well, California seemed to do the go pretty hard pretty early, didn't they? So they might be. Is it any different over there to Chicago, or is it?
We could have a whole discussion on the US and COVID-19
Okay, well, let's not do
and
that.
how crazy it is. So California did do some good things early, but it's a big state where
Right.
I think politics and lots of things come into play. So Newsom, who's the governor here, announced, and I don't know when this is going to go to air, but announced a couple of days ago
Mm.
that they're reversing some of this. So going back into closures, similar to probably what Melbourne is
Yes.
doing in Australia.
Right.
And there are certain areas that are spiking. So New York was crazy early, came back down, and California did a similar thing, but
Mm-hmm.
California seemed to not really recover properly. And summer here, people go to the beaches, people hang out. COVID's taken off again.
Man, the US is so big, it's so diverse. I know for me, when I moved there all those years ago as an Aussie, I just didn't realize, like, I moved to New York, which is
Mhm.
completely different to California or the Midwest or the South or everywhere in between, New England and that area. So it's kind of like countries in and of themselves and cultures. So I can imagine how difficult it is to manage something like COVID over there, and add to all that the politics, right?
Crazy times. And honestly, I think the idea of countries is not a bad analogy, and we may go back to something like that. And obviously, there's the 13 colonies, 13 countries essentially coming together to form
Sure.
this kind of federation that is the United States. But with things, if COVID doesn't turn the corner, I actually wouldn't be surprised if certain states say, look, we're going to lock our borders. But, you over there in Indiana, you're not taking masks seriously. And so we're in Illinois are not going to let you in, or how that's going to work out. I don't know how it's going to play out here, but there is no national coordination. And I can imagine some states saying to other states, you're not doing things the right way.
Right. Well, I live on the border here in Queensland with New South Wales, and Queensland's done very well, and the spiked areas for us have been New South Wales and Victoria, and so there's been closures of borders, and like you said, you get used to that long enough, you get used to existing within your confined. As difficult as it can be, because you rely so much on open borders and trade and tourism and stuff. But you heard it first from Mark Reddy, Justice Matters podcast. America could be going back to breaking back up into those 13 colonies. No, I won't quote you on that. But man, you've lived in the US for quite a long time now. We have had I've kind of heard about you and known about you for a long time from when from my friendships and my time on the Sunshine Coast and all the common connections we have there. And I really enjoyed coming out to the Justice Conference, and you guys, you and Vicky, just hosted me so well when I was there, and when I first met you several years back now. And I'd love to kind of go into that, a bit of your journey as well as hearing about the incredible work that you're up to now, chasing justice. But I'd like to just bring it back even more and maybe hit on some of your formative years, Mark, some of the things that have really propelled you to really be someone who fights for the oppressed, who you've oriented your life, your family, has oriented your life to serving those that are marginalized and doing everything you can, to make this world a fairer, more just, more beautiful world. I'd love to hear about where that all began for you. Can you think of a moment in time or your upbringing? Or
let me tell you my family story. I think that's probably a good place to start. So my background is actually Indian. I was born in Fiji. And so my great-grandparents, so going back for about 100 years or so, were brought as indentured labor. So the kind of, the arc of the story of slavery is when the British, ended slavery officially. Slavery got another name, and that became indentured labor. And the practice, the business side of it, continued. And one of the last people groups around the world, the British system moved around as mass in labor, were the Indians, especially the Indians from the south of India, which is where my family comes from.
Okay.
And they ended up in the Pacific. You end up with Indian people groups in sort of the Caribbean, in Central and South America, in Africa. And that's why you have this really weird diaspora of Indians around the world, especially the kind of those who moved as slaves, indentured labor, versus those who migrated through economic reasons. And so my family ended up in Fiji working essentially as sugarcane tobacco plantation workers. My father, which is now 2 generations out of that, was the first in his family to convert from Hindu to Christianity.
Wow.
And so I'm 3 generations out of that. And, mum and dad raised me in a Christian family. But you got to imagine when you've got that narrative, that arc of the story, one, it's forced migration. It's not by choice.
Right.
It's, it means that you're marginalized in the country that you're going into. When you change from one religion, especially the familiar, the family religion, to another religion, you'll know this from your time in Iraq.
Yeah.
That cultural dissonance creates a massive outsider culture as well, and you got to figure that narrative out. And so this idea of justice hasn't been one of these like intellectual ascents in that I've heard about it, I've read about it. It's actually just part of my lived
Part of you.
story, right? And the idea of faith and justice has been part of my lived story as well, because
Wow.
Christianity, when you convert, my parents converted as adults, it's
Yeah.
much more of a tangible thing, right? It's something that resonates in their everyday lived experience as well.
It's not just a conversion to a new way of thinking. It's a conversion. It's like your whole cultural identity as well as your personal identity. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right, but
Every aspect of your life.
it's every aspect of your life, but it's also very much something that if you're born into something, you have a gradual ascension in it. It's something that becomes enculturated with you. But when you come to faith and you talk to Christians who convert to faith as adults,
Yeah.
the conversion experience is much more fervent. It's much more real, much more visceral. They can
Right.
pinpoint that, and that actually starts to speak into their faith practice as well.
Yeah.
And you would have had lots of these experiences through the Middle East and lots of different places as well. People that come to faith as opposed to they're born to faith. So that was my
Wow.
experience, my family's experience. And so weirdly, my dad ended up starting InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in the Pacific, and
Okay.
we moved around as he sort of studied. So we actually ended up studying he ended up studying in Vancouver, Regent Bible College. So we did a bit of time there. And then actually in Brisbane. And during the 80s, when Fiji had the military coups, and we couldn't go back to Fiji because Dad was working with students, and we couldn't stay in Australia. And so it's weird. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was in Iraq actually with the Courtneys, who you know really well. And so they held this like digital entrepreneurship class for I guess Syrians and local Kurdish displaced people who were trying to figure out how do you carve a new career out. And so I was talking to them about branding and story, and I'm sharing my story, and the lady, one of the girls in the class, puts her hand up and goes, well, that makes you a refugee. And I never actually thought of myself as a refugee. But New Zealand took us in where Australia wouldn't keep us at the time. And so my formative years, I was raised in New Zealand, went through high school in New Zealand, and ended up back in Australia sort of my college years onwards. And so that's kind of a weird arc of a story to basically say, the family migrated. We were always part of an outside group where faith was a key part of our story. This idea of, who do you align with? Which stories do you see yourself resonating towards? The idea of the poor, the impoverished, the widow, the orphan. That was a central part of my lived experience, central part of the stories that we were, either physically part of or that we would emotionally assign towards. And so,
wow.
When I think about, is there one experience, is this one thing? It's actually, I feel like my story leads to that, and it's been part of that the whole time, which is a great blessing in some regards, but it's also one of those things that makes it hard to say, hey, I lived, if I could say to you, lots of friends of ours would say, this happened to me, and because of this, I had this experience. Whereas my story is much more around I've always been part of a group of people that I would consider marginalized in the dominant culture experience. And my aspirations have always been about raising the voice, have always been about aligning my faith, have always been about sharing Jesus. And so the idea of faith and justice, the idea of creativity, arts have been a central part of my story as far as I can remember back. So hopefully that sets a scene.
I feel, obviously, I've been following your trajectory a little bit over the years and have learnt so much from the times I've interacted with you. I feel like I'm really, kind of hearing that story, Mark, it helps me see how so often we compartmentalize these things of justice, of faith, of this, and we don't realize how intricately wound up together they can be in our identity, like you said, in your narrative. You took your whole family, though. I don't know how old your girls were and you went to Chicago. What pointed that move? Did you go to Chicago first? Did I get that wrong? Or what made you go to the US? What made you kind of...
No, we moved to Chicago. And so back when we were living in Australia, actually, I was living in Queensland at the time. I had the opportunity to lead an organization called Christian Media Australia. And during that time, my wife and I started, I guess, a part of that, which was dedicated to arts and media, and particularly how do you reconcile the creativity aspects of artists and the idea of how do you position your faith story in that? How do you work in the marketplace? How do you bring creativity into the church? All those kind of things. So Spark grew out of that idea.
Yes.
And a friend of ours was a speaker at the Justice Conference, which had been about 3 or 4 years old at the time. The Justice Conference was in LA that year. And they were looking for new leadership. And he had released a movie, weirdly, that I'd been involved in distributing in Australia a couple of years earlier. And he sort of suggested that, if they were looking for leadership, they could see what Mark and Vicky are doing with Spark and what's on their heart and see if there were some ideas that connected. And so at that time, World Relief owned the Justice Conference, and they
and just to interrupt you there, the Justice Conference is a US predominantly. It's all over the US, a conference that brings faith.
Yeah, so the Justice Conference actually started out probably 2010 out of church in Bend in Oregon. Ken Weitzman was the pastor of the church at the time, and Ken had the idea with Stephen Bowman, who was with World Relief. He wasn't the CEO at that time, but later became CEO of World Relief. And they wanted to share the ideas of faith and justice, particularly with an evangelical audience in the US. Yeah, which traditionally the story is, and depending where you are in the world, the faith narrative and the Christian faith narrative may mean different things to you, but particularly in the US, especially go back a decade or more or so ago, and particularly amongst white evangelicals, the idea of salvation and the idea of doing good works was quite separate.
Right.
And what they wanted to do was look at how does the idea of God's heart for the vulnerable resonate with his purposes for our lives, and call that a movement of justice. So it wasn't a separate sort of social justice idea. It was the reconciliation of worship and justice, prayer and action. And that grew from, an idea that the church had in Bend in Oregon to a movement around the US, and the conference moved around, but essentially it was one annual conference. They had decided to move it to Chicago, had decided to bring in new leadership. That's when World Relief took over the financial side of the conference, brought me on as a leader on it. And the conference now is in about 8 or 9 different countries around the world, actually Australia as well, New Zealand, South Africa.
So I think 5 years in Australia now, which is great.
Yeah. Tier Australia is the key partner there, and they're doing some interesting things. Actually, the thing I love about the Justice Conference in Australia story is it started the year I moved to the US. And so you talk about us moving to the US a long time ago. It feels like a long time ago. It's only been 5 years.
No way.
And so, we had the opportunity to be part of
Mark, that's crazy. It just feels like so much longer. I don't know.
It does. It does for us as well. So the weird thing is we moved here. So I started commuting to the US to set up my move with the family about 6 months earlier. Right?
Okay.
So for about 6 months in the middle of 2014, I was coming to the US, coming to Chicago about once a month for about 2 weeks, and then Australia for 2 weeks. It was a bad idea. That's a terrible idea for commuting. It's a long way. But it took us a little while to get the family right. Schools in Australia run January to December. Schools in the US run.
Just talk to my wife. It's not easy. And I'm sure, how old were your girls at the time?
They were 8 and 9 at the time, I
so
believe. Maybe 7 and 8. So about that
grade 3 and 4 and all that kind of. Yeah, right. It's hard work, man. Wow.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, so the US at that time is also going through interesting. So what happened towards the second half of 2014 is that's when Mike Brown gets shot in. So his death marks the beginning of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And so my foray into trying to steward the church, especially the broad chunk of the evangelical church around faith and justice issues, is bookended by Black Lives Matter and sort of the build of the Me Too movement and kind of globalization around some of the justice stuff. The 2016 US presidential election to now like COVID and everything else. So it certainly hasn't been a time lacking in issues that are represent justice issues.
Yeah. So you've bookended your time and your work as it is now in the US with some pretty eventful times in history, especially in the issues of justice. And I am really, really excited about where that's kind of led you to now, because obviously you've worked in a variety of non-government agencies and justice issues and church-based and faith-based groups. I mean, it's really impressive. I'd have to say, just to see the ways you've just navigated through so many different forums with this work. But it's kind of led you to this co-founding Chasing Justice, and you've got a podcast. I've enjoyed listening to a couple of those episodes already, and just learning as you're launching out, just starting this thing at this moment in time is quite, I think, well, you could say non-coincidental. I would say it seems to be the perfect moment for this work. I'd love for you to share with the audience a bit about what Chasing Justice is, what led you to really launch out and start it, and we can talk more about that.
And thank you for that, because Chasing Justice is something that I am really excited about. So we left World Relief and the Justice Conference about a year ago, and we knew all along that God would use what's in our hand, and which was a lot of our skills around creativity, around building movements. We didn't know exactly how the next season of life would play out, but one of the speakers of the Justice Conference a couple of years ago, 2017, was a great friend of ours, also from Chicago, a lady called Sandra Van Opstal, pastor in Chicago, speaker, worship leader, author in her own right. And Sandra was also looking for, what could be something that is part of her calling, her next season in life as well. And so I reached out to Sandra and said, hey, do you want to do something together? And what is it that we wanted to do? And, the coincidence of the timing side of it shouldn't be underestimated, because, where COVID-19 forces some outcomes, I don't think it necessarily brings new things to be. It's like a vice. It squeezes something, and all the stuff that was already there squeezes out in some way, right? So racism was there, and it was just forced out in some ways. Or the idea of, what do we do with our work lives because jobs are starting to disappear, or what's this generational movement that's taking place? What are young people seeing the boomers talking about? And we see some conflicts in that space. And we had initially talked about launching around, September, which is in the US, the season that, new things seem to come as a new school year. The UN meets about that time. But with COVID-19, we sort of decided to launch in about February, March this year with just sort of Instagram lives and podcasts and see where the audience was and what messages would be resonating towards it. Our audience, or who we feel called to, the people that we feel like we're speaking to and generating a community around, would be, we would consider them younger Christians in the context of sort of 20 to 35-year-olds. We would say that, there is an evangelical nature to their faith, but they may not be assigning that tag because that tag is so worn and
it means
has so much baggage associated with it in the US. But it is a camp that talks about an individual personal relationship with God, and that sort of tends to be the centrality of that idea. But it's also people that may be worn to the tag of even the church, right? The church carries its own baggage. So they're looking for a connection with their faith. They're looking for a connection with the burning issues. They're probably, we find this amongst ourselves as well, confused and overwhelmed. There's so much going on. We don't know where to begin. We don't know that God actually cares about all these issues, but there needs to be a better way. And we know that is there's a broad community that fits within that. But one of the things that was really central to our DNA, central to our thinking, and things that we built a whole sort of framework of Chasing Justice around was the people that are going to speak into the teachers, the communicators, the people that you'll be hearing about will be leaders of color predominantly. And our reasoning for that is in the US in particular, and that that feels like a marginalized idea. It feels like when you talk about theology, it's like European theology is central, but all these other theologies are peripheral to that.
Right.
And we wanted to, really center a set of a lived experience, those who could say, this is my lived experience, this is my theology set, this is my worldview, who the message is open to everybody, but you are going to listen to, you're going to be mentored by, you're going to hear from leaders of color, especially women of color.
Yes.
And that was one of the things that, partnering with Sandra, that was really important, from, making her a key voice in it. So Sandra is actually the executive director, the chief executive officer, CEO of Chasing Justice. And my role is much more around the board role and vision fundraising, that side of things. But Sandra is actually the front face of it. She leads a lot of the discussions. You'll see her on our podcast, on our Instagram Live. And then we have a great community of young people around that as well. So Tyler Burns, who's a pastor out of Florida, and a lot of key, Jasmine out of Chicago, John also out of Florida, and people all around the country, past leaders, lay people, young people that are just speaking their lived experience, and then community around the world. And one of the beauties about someone like Sandra and my experience as well is that as we've traveled, we've kind of built this cadre, this community of people that are in Mexico City or in Kampala or in Iraq or Turkey, wherever they are, and they're young, they're doing incredible things. God's doing some powerful things through these people, and we get to connect with them as well. So I believe Chasing Justice is as much a global idea as it is a US idea. Definitely starting with how do you move people from position A to position B, and how do you provide the opportunity to learn, especially from leaders of color and women of color in that regard.
Yeah, I so appreciate that central focus that you have to amplify people of color in that work, and like you said, women especially. Even listening to the podcast where Sandra was saying they were talking about why this podcast, and there was like, because we need women and women of color doing podcasts, and not just white men. And I'm like, oh no, I'm starting a podcast. But it was just, for me, I would just, I just so felt that is so right and so true, and so much needed in my work that I was doing when I met with you a couple years back in Chicago in your home. I was going to do, I had a role of poverty alleviation in Middle East, North Africa, and our emphasis was not to go into that community with the solutions, as if we have the answer for their communities to help them come up. Our role was primarily to amplify, to create and facilitate the discussion so they would be centralized, so that the solutions to their communities would come from them. We would not go in and ask, what do you need? As if we had the answer to their needs. It's like, no, what do you have? And empower them with, look, you don't realize you've been told this narrative that you're dependent, that there's paternalistic, systemic issues in the way we do relief and charity and aid have been existent. And I see how important that is, and I see how vitally important it is in the work of addressing especially racial injustice and immigration and refugee injustice issues. It's inspirational for me, and I really appreciate how you're leading that way. You've done that, I know, in not creating a space for yourself, but always for other people to speak into that. I'd like to touch on this specific moment we're in right now, and I feel like I really want to learn and hear. I've been in this process of really trying to do a deep dive myself personally in and so I really appreciate having someone like you on to just kind of, from your perspective in the US, Black Lives Matters it's a resurgence. It's like you said, it's been around for quite some time. I think 2014 you mentioned, and it's sweeping the world. It's realizing, it's recognizing, hey, this is not just a localized issue of systemic racism. This is a global issue. And in Australia, we've got the focus once again on the Indigenous community, on Aboriginal Lives Matters, on death incarceration, and these issues are so widespread. And I'd love for you to kind of share with the Australian audience, how Chasing Justice is addressing that, and how you, in particular, what you're learning right now from this moment.
And I think part of it is actually elevating the voices of those who are directly impacted by it. I don't think you always need to put a translation piece into it. Sometimes you just need to speak truth to power. Sometimes you just need to get out of the way and let those whose lived experience, whose voice needs to be heard, be heard. I think what's really important right now is as much about, understanding Black Lives Matter, in terms of how does it impact, especially the younger generation of Black leaders in the US, as they say, this is my claim, my time, my voice, as it is to, project forward and see where this is going to go, or what's likely to be some of the hurdles that are coming next as well. And what I see through this time and this season is an understanding, and I think the reason why it's swept around the world is, one, the issues are the same around the world, and the issue is that there is an element of those who have power, who are using that power in a way to oppress, to marginalize, to set economic systems, to set judicial systems, to set educational systems in a way that creates oppressive hurdles for those, or even creates complete barriers. So there's a disenfranchisement from certain communities. Yeah. And that's wrong. From a faith perspective, we don't need to say that's wrong because Jesus says it's wrong. No, it's wrong because humans should not treat other human beings in that way. But we were complicit because the church has been so much a part of upholding some of these systems. And so we end up using another Jesus example to bring down, a previous Jesus example. But I think for, the trajectory of where things are at right now is it's a binary discussion in many senses about Black life, but it's a macro discussion around oppression, around colonization, around injustice in a way of whether it's majority, it's power. Right. In some contexts, the power isn't with the majority, but it's those who have power and how they're oppressing, or what systems are they creating or perpetuating against those who don't have power. And in the US, it's very much, the historic narrative from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration is present. It's not something that you can say, hey, we're picking and choosing of these things. They're very much structural. It's very much real. It's very lived in many lives. And as a brown person who's lived in the US, my lived experience falls into a similar channel. I've had similar lived, whether I've been pulled over by police or whether I see barriers in career pathways or other things, they're there. But it's not the same as someone who's lived in the US their whole life in that experience. Wow. Now, the same way, why is that idea resonating around the world? Because what we're seeing around the world, particularly in Western democracies, is the idea that the system that is failing us in so many ways. And we need to address those systemic failures. Those who feel like the system has left them behind, the system is failing them, are finding avenues and addressing those avenues. So, why is Black Lives Matter marches happening in Germany? Why is it happening in largely white European countries? Because there's an immigration discussion that's coming in there, or there are other issues that are coming into place. What's happening? So the narrative of slavery is so much bigger when we think about the impact of slavery that had on countries like Brazil or in South America generally. Yes. But that area, that issue of the class layered upon race, layered upon colorism, has been dormant amongst cultures like in Brazil or other places, and now that's coming to the fore. People are, whether it's because of the president or other things that are happening in place, they're saying this thing needs to change. The system isn't working for us, and so I think what we're seeing around the world has been triggered by the U.S. narrative of Black Lives Matter, but it means different things in different contexts. Yeah, and that's why it's an Aboriginal narrative in Australia.
Yes.
But downstream, it may also become an immigrant narrative. It may
Oh, for
become a narrative
sure.
around assimilation. In Australia, very much, everyone's welcome as long as you become a mate in this culture, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to
You've
uphold
got
your
to,
cultural integrity,
yeah,
what happens to that?
assimilation is assimilating to my culture, but uh, I've sat in round tables in community groups even here in Australia where that even ideology of my culture is very narrowly defined, forgetting that the fact that Australia is such a multicultural culture, even in and of itself, like you said, it can't be defined by just those that have power. It is defined by everyone that has made Australia what it is. And yeah.
One of the kind of weird historical quirks about the US is its racism has compartmentalized society in a way that gives these kind of pocket cultures the ability to um, create for themselves an identity. So in Australia, you don't tend to make, say, Chinese Australians in the same way that you have Chinese Americans,
Yeah.
right? And or African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
or I even hear phrases like Australian Americans, for that kind of immigrant people group that are here. That doesn't happen in Australia in the same way. Maybe that has changed in the last sort of 5 years that I've been out. And it's much more of a, you use the word multicultural. I would actually challenge it. I'd say Australia can be multi-ethnic, but it's definitely a dominant culture environment.
Yeah.
You can come and bring your ethnicity to it. In fact, it's exotic in a way where we'll celebrate your food, your dance,
Yeah.
whatever it is. But actually, it's a monocultural society,
right?
or a dominant cultural society.
Mm.
And I think downstream that will break something that becomes challenged in Australia. And hopefully it's something that adds to the fabric of Australia in a way that creates something beautiful, something great, something good. There's always going to be a tension, because when you elevate something, that the people that have power, the culture that is dominant at the time, will always feel a sense of a loss, because its power is in some way diluted. And so it's going to fight to hold on to the thing that it's losing.
It will always fight, right? I heard it once said, you cannot embrace the new until you let go of the old. And
sometimes the old doesn't want to let go,
and the
right?
old
So you have
won't
to
let
fight.
go. It won't let go easily. You can't kind of say, well, let's just kind of keep a little bit of both, right? I think, to use a Jesus analogy, he talks about there being new wineskin and old wineskin. You just kind of can't have both if we really are to forge into what is new, what we know is good, what is right and just and fair. Unfortunately, the old's got to go, and it ain't going to go without a fight. I kind of feel like that's kind of almost a good analogy of where we're at. There is going to be a fight. There is going to be pushback. There is going to be maybe a back and forth going on, and hence the need for organizations like yourself to lead the way, lead the discussion in a grace-filled, informative way. And can you speak how that can happen in Australia here as well, how we can kind of ride the wave? I know you're in the States there and you're very attuned to what's going on and maybe feel a little distant, but I think you have a real unique voice to be able to kind of maybe speak into some of these issues as Australians here.
Look at that. I think one of the really interesting things about Australia is that this discussion is happening and it has been growing, and it's good. I remember I mentioned in part of my story is I grew up in New Zealand, essentially my formative years.
Yeah.
I remember coming over to Australia and we would start events, and even when we first had our Spark conference in Sydney, and there was the idea of, how do we acknowledge the Aboriginal legacy to, whether you call it a welcome to nation or the recognition of the custodians of this land.
Yeah.
Even at that time, and this is going back a decade ago, that was an unusual thing to bring up. Whereas in New Zealand, we would always start something by recognizing the traditional owners of the land, or, there'd be some sort of Maori welcoming, or a sense of dignifying those who came before us, even from a spiritual perspective. And so, I can see even in the last sort of decade, 15 years, Australia making more progress. Now I see this thing happening much more commonly.
Yeah.
So whilst that was a fringe idea to the dominant culture, it wasn't an thing that wasn't happening in other places, but it was a fringe idea to the dominant culture. I see it much more present now in Australian culture. So I see that progress being made. I also recognize, even as that narrative was coming through, when I was there, I'm not sure if you remember when Stan Grant's book came out.
Yeah.
And things like that, and how much of a pushback that received. And look, there are questions about individuals and characters, but there's an arc of a story, right?
Sure.
And how that was seen to be, pushy, controversial. Why is he doing this sort of stuff? Now these kind of stories come through, and they're met with, some met with resistance, but it feels more common, more normal. And I think that's part of the journey of progress. Australia is starting to face some of these stories, these hurdles. And all that to say is that previously what would have been considered to be fringe ideas, or even like progressive ideas or out there ideas, are starting to become a bit more accepted, especially amongst the younger generation within the dominant culture. And friends of ours like Jared McKenna with Inverse Podcast and others that are key part of that story, that narrative, and how do you reconcile core theology, faith narratives, Aboriginal culture, justice issues in Australia. I think what I'm excited about is that you don't need to compartmentalize it to Australia either. We live in a globalized world, and so you can learn. You just got to figure out, how do I apply this in my context? And I think that's the bit that Australians have to grapple with for themselves. There is weirdly, my one of the sports I enjoyed, even though I tell a story of my family's, marginalization in some regards, the idea of golf. When I was in New Zealand, I got introduced to golf by some friends, and golf is one of those weird things, right? It's a social game, but it's it's a social sport, but an individual game. And so justice in this regard is a social sport, but it's an individual game. How do the individuals, how do me, myself, how do Tim, how do others in Australia, what do we need to do to our lives? What choices do we need to make? How do we need to educate ourselves? What are we doing with our purchasing power? How are we applying our agency, where we're placed with our jobs, what we're doing with the choices we're making, who we're voting for, whether, sending our kids to certain schools, all those kind of things. Those are all part of a cumulative effect that leads to a lifestyle. And I would say a lifestyle of faith and justice. And how can what inputs can I put in my world? What am I reading? If I find there is a deficit, or I'm finding something new and that new thing challenges me in some way, what am I putting into my thought process, my education system, that allows me to expand my horizon, provide new frames to what it is? What am I doing with my relationship set? What am I doing with my social set? What am I doing with my income, my discretion? And how can I lead towards a lifestyle of justice? One of the frames for chasing justice is as much about addressing, you talked about immigration, you talked about, my wife is really heavily involved in incarceration issues here in the US, refugees, race, gender. These can feel like bowling balls, and you're juggling bowling balls, right? And it becomes unwieldy at some point. There's so many issues, it becomes overwhelming, confused. Not only am I confused by the issues, I'm living in a time where the media and the political system is intentionally adding to that confusion, right? And it's like a simplified narrative, a heuristic will make it easy for me to sell something, but that simplified narrative is unhelpful with the nuances needed for this time.
Exactly.
And so I've got to create a framework, a lattice work system for my faith, for my intellectual capacity, for my lived experience, my family, that says no matter what the issues are, I can add all these issues. And even though it's going to feel overwhelming at times, there is sufficient robustness to it that I can live a lifestyle of justice, that I don't need to ebb and flow and swing with the issue of the day.
Right.
That I can provide a narrative that actually is also central to my faith, that Jesus is a key part of that story for someone like myself. And I know, there are people that will be listening to this that don't have a faith perspective, or don't even have an evangelical perspective. But that would say, look, is there a central idea of morality? Is there a central compass that drives me? And that the framework that I'm building around that can handle issues, especially when the political side of that issue feels so vexed at any given time.
No, I love that. I mean, if love's your thing, what does that look like? And look like certain people are welcome and others are not. Certain people should have advantage and opportunity and others not. And I get that.
Love's a great idea until it's
Isn't
challenged.
it? Right,
Love's a
yeah.
wonderful idea that Christians want to talk about until it costs something
Exactly.
and it becomes uncomfortable. And love means that I actually need to think about, do prisons need to exist? Because when I think
Right.
about love, that maybe it's not the best way to do something. How do we deal with immigration when it comes to love? How do we deal with our Muslim neighbors when we're talking about
Yeah.
intercultural, interreligious exchange?
And well, so Jesus says, right, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And obviously love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And that concept, and it gets challenged, well, who is my neighbor? Right? Well, then when you dig deeper into that idea, you see how Jesus reframes that even to be not just someone who's different than you, but who ultimately is your enemy, right? The person you would least want to do that. And I love, like you said, I mean, love can be a soft and fluffy idea that we like to reserve for our own little people that we, have our own in our own little tribe, our own little world. But when that intersects with those that are perceived different to us, those that are perceived our enemies, it really challenges all of these things, and rightly so.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the I get confused when Christians use love as a reason to not do something. And that's the element where I go,
Talk
well,
about that. I'd like to hear what you mean. That's great.
well, so for example, I've got to love my small group at the expense of the big group. That kind of idea
Yes.
of love. So
Yes.
it's an exclusive nature to what they describe love as, whereas love is so much more challenging when it's dangerous, when it's vulnerable, when it's selfless, when it's actually could cost you everything. In the Old Testament, you're talking about neighbor. In the Jewish context, there is a school of thought that would say that it is talking about Jewish communities or the people
Right.
group that are associated with. But then you go to the New Testament because there are no Jews and no Gentiles. And so we end up with an arc of a story that allows a framework to exist
Which goes
that
back
says
to
if
what
I'm
you're
going to
saying.
compartmentalize it
Yes.
just here, I'm going to have this meaning.
Yes.
Or if I'm going to compartmentalize it just here, I'm going to have this meaning. But if I look at the arc of the story, I know where this is going. I know what Jesus is talking about. I know what the story that the Bible is telling us.
Yes.
It is selfless.
Yes.
It is about how we as a people group of believers, the people group of faith, what do we represent to a broader world? And what messages are we doing in that regard? I think one of the, as we think about plagues now and COVID-19, one of the, Rodney Stark talks about, Christianity really grew, especially through the Roman era, where Christians chose to sacrifice their lives to stay with those in cities that were dying. And that's where Christianity grew in reputation so strongly, because it was so sacrificial. It was the ones that were willing to stay with the dying that gave it its enigma, that gave it its kind of real appeal to so many people. And then it kind of grows and blossoms across the Roman Empire. So, the challenge is that it becomes really attractive for something sacrificial. It grows to become part of the dominant power paradigm. And then its struggle is to go back to something that's really sacrificial, because you're always challenging between sacrifice and power.
I mean, in short,
and that's kind of the story of
in
Christian.
short, could you say it's when love and justice become separated, when they're not seen as one and the same thing, ultimately?
Absolutely. Even when faith and justice become separate. I think that's where we start to realize that there is an agenda associated with what we're doing. And when we can use, when Christianity in one hand is used to uphold slavery, is used to uphold Nazism, is used to uphold supremacy in one regard, you know that it's co-opted in some way.
Yeah.
When it's used to defend the status quo so that the system cannot be challenged, and therefore we can't try new things, we can't dismantle systems that are inherently oppressing people. then you go, there is something wrong with
There's something
the
inherently wrong with
base
that.
allegiance here. It isn't
Yeah.
an allegiance to the sacrificial love that is talked about in the Bible. It's
Hmm.
an allegiance to power and dominance. And I think that's where,
Yeah.
whether you're separating love and justice, you're actually just compartmentalizing, or you're using the word love, but actually just really saying that it's connected to the power that keeps me happy, keeps me attuned to the privilege that
Secure,
I have.
safe. Yeah.
Um, so, I think that's probably more of the issue than it is decoupling it from justice.
Yes, love isn't safe. It's kind of like in the podcast you were talking recently on your Chasing Justice podcast about Aslan and Amos and that idea of love in that great novel by C.S. Lewis, defining who is this Aslan, and he's good but he's not safe.
Safe.
And I think that's what we have to see what love and justice is. If it is a venture into safe, messy, uncharted territories. And I don't know about you, Mark. I've never, if I can look back in my life and think of anything that I've achieved or set out to do, it's never been because I decide to play it safe or
Right.
decided to not, just to stay within my little comfort zone. It's always been when I've stepped out in humility, in vulnerability, in the face of fear, right?
Right.
And I think I love that. I love that idea of restoring that to what love looks like and what doing
Right.
justice
Yeah, Cornel
looks
West,
like.
justice is what love looks like in public. Um, you know,
Mm,
that's
wow.
the idea of,
That's a good one.
how does this manifest?
Mm,
We can talk about it, but how does it manifest? I want to be
mm,
cautious around the idea of big adventurous living, and that
mm.
it sort of ends up. I know you've done this and you've moved around the world. You lived in
Sure.
Iraq. My family's moved around the world, and it
Sure.
can often feel like those people who do big things are the ones that are doing justice or living a just life. I think justice is something that's very ordinary in many regards,
Mm.
and
Yeah,
we've got
that's
to
good.
figure out how that ordinariness becomes practiced. How is it part of my everyday life? There
Yeah,
are
come
some
on.
great
That's good.
adventures, and a lot of us are privileged to have those great adventures.
Hmm.
But I don't want to make that the only expression of justice
You
or
got
the
to
only
go on that
expression of a
mission trip
just
to the
life.
other side of the world is the kind of mentality or
Right, and that's so problematic in many
yeah,
ways as well. You're willing to go on the other side of the world, but you're not willing to sit down with your neighbor or do something in
exactly.
your own city. And you're
Yes.
going to save someone versus learn from them. That idea of
And it's freeing, to be
mission-led
honest.
justice.
It's freeing. It frees your. I mean, I remember when I came back from Iraq and just going through depression, thinking I
Mhm.
was in the middle of something I was so passionate about, and so I felt like I was doing something great, right?
Mhm.
And that's, I guess that's just, it can be quite a normal process of grieving, of losing. I wasn't, it was a lot of emotions, but the beauty of being able to find, well, there's these same issues, these same struggles are happening to people around me, no matter how pretty and nice it looks on the outside, no matter how great Australia is with great schools and no crime, or whatever you want to kind of picture Australia as, this incredible place. There's so much that can be done in your own backyard, in your street, in your school, um, and and it it's it's really important to emphasize that the
Right.
mundane, the everyday, the very local way in which you can do justice.
Right, and it's also going to come down to your purchasing. Like where
Mm-hmm.
are you choosing to invest?
Yeah.
What is your pension fund doing?
Oh,
Your
don't mention that, Mark. Come on. No, just kidding.
no, but totally.
Yeah,
Or,
yeah, yeah.
the idea of divestment. Look, I'm not into cancel culture in the context of just picking and choosing what you want to do, but I think you have to have integrity. Integrity
Okay, yeah,
across
yeah.
your financial choices, the integrity across your purchasing power, you as the purchaser, and what can you do? Especially if you live in, Australia, which is essentially a capitalist Western democracy that is
Mm-hmm.
built on capitalism as a tool. But there are also things where you've got to challenge the status quo.
Mm.
it's not so much I've got to go around the world, but what if my challenge is how is Australian history taught to my children?
Oh my goodness, yes.
How, what do are
I
they
can't
going to
even
learn about
remember. I can't
blackbirding?
even remember growing up. I mean, I think in Australian history was Ned Kelly. Yeah, just thinking about my own, education is very. I mean, I remember as a little kid going to the library and reading a book about Dreamtime stories, but it was just so little, and I've just been, yeah,
Right.
doing obviously deep dive now, but realizing, oh my goodness, I missed out on so much. And it, you know, you're right.
I remember having a conversation recently with in our family, and we were talking about the slavery in Australian's history, and my wife, who's Australian, she didn't know about that story because she was never taught it.
Mm,
And her generation, her family heritage goes back to the first fleets. Like, it's a documented lineage that one of her
mm,
ancestors came in on the first fleets. Um, and it was something that, for whatever reason, my friends and which were Solomon Islanders and people
mm,
that would talk about it, because it was their families that were brought as slaves to Australia, literally as slaves out here
mm.
blackbirding. And Australia doesn't have a slave history. No, it does.
Oh
Obviously, you just
wow.
weren't taught about it,
Mm,
let alone the Aboriginal genocide,
my goodness. Yeah.
land rights, and all the things that enculturate now to saying, well, why is this group getting millions of dollars? Nothing's changing. What's happening with violence in Aboriginal communities? Yes, but what have we built?
Yeah.
What is the system that we're trying to uphold here? What makes it easy to tell this story and not another
Mm,
story?
yeah. I mean, there's and if you're listening, and you're an Aussie and you want to learn, I know there's a great organization, Common Grace, that has a lot of resources, and I've learned a lot from just reading up. And you mentioned Jared McKenna and the Inverse podcast, but there's a lot of work that Jared has done and others as well. So you can kind of there's a kind of reference point. Shout out to that to kind of go and learn. I think it's really really important. I found that really important myself, as well as all the great new documentaries and how it's coming to the forefront. I'm seeing on my feeds on SBS and ABC and on all the different streamings. Now there's a lot more out there that I can kind of listen to. Um, it's been really, really good. I think. Well, I
Yeah.
know, at least from my own experience, to just see that more available and accessible for us.
Absolutely. And actually, it's one of the things that I miss about not being in Australia is services like SBS and
Yeah.
ABC.
Oh,
Um,
they're great.
we just don't have that here in the same comedy PBS. But the
Sure.
ability for that kind of content to be accessible for
Right.
a large majority of the country, in a way that is compelling, that's entertaining,
Yeah.
that is truthful. And I think,
And I appreciate that about Australian culture because I remember the news I watched every night was always SBS. Like that was like world news was kind of like we didn't watch Channel 9 or the more traditional channels because it just for in my family it was like, well, what's going on in the world? And there was that I guess at least in my home, that kind of more world conscious, more global thinking. um
that's great. You're in a
yeah.
unique setting then, I think, as a white Australian growing up watching SBS World News. Good for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, my parents were definitely, they were. I owe a lot of my passion for justice and world issues through their example they set. They were immigrants that came over from England, but and obviously had to had obviously a lot of opportunity, but I was born in Indonesia, and they decided to move and serve in West Papua, and work there. And so yeah, always felt like we had in our home was there was always those from Solomon Islands or Papua New Guinea
Hmm.
or was kind of in our home like almost all the time. It was
Yeah.
so grateful for that experience. I confess, I I looked back at all my baby photos and I was always being held by, I had this black little onesie on as a little baby, and looking back, I'm like, wow, I was always with black kids and black people. And I literally remember thinking to myself, man, I just wish I was black. I really, really did as a kid. It just felt like that's, it sounds silly, maybe not silly, but just thinking about that. But yeah, anyways.
And well, that actually speaks to the idea of what becomes normative in our stories, right? So
Right, exactly.
you grew up in an environment where it was normal to be black, and you were the one that was outside of that system. Whereas a lot of people in Australia don't grow up in that context, or don't see gender in the same way, and so they don't see, black woman leading or a woman of color leading, and so to elevate those who you don't normally see as the normative, to find a way of positioning that in conversations and roles and leadership. I think that becomes a key part of the other generations or others in our community finding a normative experience then.
Man, so true. How do we, I think it comes back to how do we elevate, how do we empower those and let that that voice be heard and led from and lead us into creating a new norm, right? Creating the new norm that I know, that new, let's say, wineskin, that new system, that new way of looking at and living in a just world, that new just world we all long for. And you've been doing an incredible work. It's a hard work, fighting for justice. It's a difficult, challenging work. There's a lot of setbacks. Time is running away, but is there, in this quest for a better world, in this quest for a more just, free, compassionate world that we all know and we all long for, what have been some of the greatest challenges, maybe even personally for you in that?
Look, I think the challenges have been trying to figure out how to be humble in the different, when ideas challenge you, when you're trying to look at something and go, hang on, that's not how I was told this story. That's not how I was told to accept this people group for this reason. How do I embrace the possibility of that in a context that is going to be so disruptive to the worldview that I've grown up in, or so disruptive to the frame in which I have traditionally seen the world in? And do I have enough humility to enter that discussion with a, well, what if scenario? And I think that's been challenging because along the way, yes, my story has been the story of being marginalized in all those different contexts, but actually a lot of traditional Christian orthodoxy has been part of my story as well. So as we talk about power or privilege or race, part of it is how do I challenge some of my own built-in bias and thinking in that, because are we all God's children? Should we just all get along? Why are we talking about these tough things?
Right.
Or what is the role of gender in leadership? What is, where are we going in the future of thinking? Where, even beyond that, we're talking about issues here to do with human dignity, time, identity, all the stuff that's associated with our current present time. But as we project forward, what is the role of science? What is the role, yes, the environment and ecology is going to be important, but what about AI? What about information independence? What about, the collapse of ecosystems? Where are we going in that regard, and who are we listening? Who are our Christian thinkers in that space? And what if the people that I need to think and listen, people I need to listen to and ideas I need to think about aren't coming from the people that I would naturally want to believe, or I would naturally want to associate with? Right. What is my what if in that? What is my humility in that? And that's not easy. And I would say that's taken a lot of unpacking of my faith tradition and understanding how to walk with grace in that journey. And for some people, and I
Which
don't
it's
know.
a coming to terms, maybe, right, with even like the fact that the church and maybe elements of Orthodox Christianity has some skeletons in its own closet that need to be addressed with and dealt with, and I think of even my own faith. I don't know how it relates to you, but when you grow up within a certain tradition, there's a lot of things you kind of just take on as default positions or default zones, and it does become difficult sometimes to have to reconcile with that. Like you say, when it comes to dealing with a variety of issues that would maybe challenge the way the way
Correct. Yeah.
I just inherited, let's say,
Mhm.
those stances. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you don't really know how you're going to respond to something until you're in the pressure of the moment,
Mm.
or your world falls apart in some way, and you've got to
Hmm.
figure out how you deal with that. And I think
Hmm.
that's part of the really tough part of our stories and our experiences is that often we're not going to know until it gets really bad in
The
some
crap hits
capacity.
the fan kind of thing.
And I've
Mm.
found that in different parts of my life is I
Hmm.
wish that I was a better learner. I wish that I could understand the arc of the story that God wants me to understand without having to hit rock bottom or to hit a collapse in some way that it forces me to pivot my shift.
Mm.
But sometimes that was the only way that I was going to do it.
It's the blessing in
Uh,
disguise, almost.
yeah. We all talk about there's always an opportunity,
Uh-huh.
and I've made some big mistakes along the way, and I wish that I'd found those opportunities in a way in a path that wasn't as costly or
Mm.
uh, as hurtful in some regards. But I also think that all of those stories, all those difficulties, all those hurdles, all those scars make us who we are.
Mm.
And I think you talked about what are the key values. You talked about
Mm.
humility and
Mm-hmm.
grace. I would say empathy is one of the key
Mm-hmm.
ones. And empathy, I think, comes down to an experience set in some way, as well as understanding the position of others. And for me, what I can see through my story is that I've had to experience a lot of things to have the humility and the empathy to see people in certain lights and to challenge even the status quo of my frame set, my religious orthodoxy,
Mm.
to go that could be wrong,
Mm.
uh, and there needs to be a different way. And
Mm.
I think that's it. Have a natural curiosity, have a humility,
Mm-hmm.
and have a desire to really seek God in it and trust the journey.
Man, I love that. When people go to another culture, another country, which is a very gift if you have the opportunity to do that, and suddenly everything's different. They call that culture shock, right? And sometimes the only way for you to truly see or experience it is to go through that shock, culture shock, and whether it's
Mm-hmm.
you know, a few guys here in the studio here, we get in chat. We've talked that coined the term faith shock. Where suddenly you're like, wow, that's different. And so often we like to say, well, this culture's right and this culture's wrong. The way they do things, we get very black and white binary in that discussion. And I think bringing that into our faith, bringing that into our journey, bringing it into the humility. Hey, I'm on a journey and I'm trying to discover a more um, a robust, more a faith that really is able to 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 be applied into this very crazy, wonderful world that we live in. That constantly being challenged and being shocked is can be difficult. I know I've quite often, too often, not had the grace in response to things that have challenged me and made me feel a little shaky or insecure. But
Mm-hmm.
going through that shock and that process is, I think that's, like you said, it can be difficult when you're faced with it, or if it's come through a trial or failure or whatever that might be. Patience and perseverance to get to the other side. Give yourself a little grace. And it gives you so much empathy, like you said, for other people as well. Oh my gosh, I've just seen things from my perspective. Oh, I can see things from another view now. Makes us all richer for it. Thank you for sharing that, Mark. That's that's almost another discussion for another time, I think. But a good one, a really good one. So I'd love to point to the future here now a little bit as we close up. Your hope. What is your hope for the future? What is your hope for chasing justice? What is your hope for I know that in you is someone who is an optimist, is someone who can wrestle with the visceral struggle, but also see and know that there is a future that's worth fighting for. What is that for you, mate?
So I think on the Chasing Justice front, we're launching curriculums and mentorship programs, and I'm really optimistic to see how that grows and that flourishes. So people can have individual learning pathways, and they can have mentored experience pathways.
Wow!
Taking someone from just a follower to living a just life, right? Who becomes an ambassador, who becomes someone whose life is about advocating for others, for disrupting systems of oppression, to elevating
like a discipleship pathway almost.
Absolutely.
In that process.
I actually think that everything that we're doing is about discipleship. I think everything that we've got right now is a fruit of discipleship, right? So I don't think that we can say that the what's wrong with the world is because there's been a lack of discipleship from the church. I think a lot of it is to do with how we have discipled people to get the results that we're getting now. So I think there is another form of discipleship that will lead to a whole generation of people that see Jesus central, that see making the cause of the oppressed, the marginalized, the vulnerable. We talk about the orphans and the widows as a key part of that, but also like what is economic justice, what is environmental justice, what are we looking to in the future, and that Chasing Justice creates a framework and a mechanism for that. Something that I'm really excited about is, and I see it in my kids, right? I see this idea of generational change.
Yeah.
Something really weird happened the other day that there was a political rally by the president, and TikTok and K-pop fans all bought out like tickets to the event, so that they thought millions of people were going to attend, and they did. And weirdly, one of my daughters said, our generation, we went and got these tickets. I was like, wait, it's a throwaway line, but you're absolutely right. Your generation is going to do something really incredible. And whilst we're in this melee right now, the mix of people that are fighting to hold on to what they're going to lose, people that have held on too long, the generation change happening, the gender norm changes that are coming through the middle of all of that, the environmental stuff that's happening, economic recession. Like, there is a craziness that's happening right now, but I am really optimistic about, the whatever you call Gen Z, the idea of, this next the younger generation, what they're going to do. Now, the bit that I would really pray for is that they have a strong connection with Jesus, a strong connection with the grace of the gospel, because I have no doubt that they can do without that. And I think that there's going to be so much more impactful when the centrality of the gospel is a key part of that story as well.
Oh, I love that, Mark. Thank you. I'm looking forward to getting, I tried to hit on the curriculum button on your website, and I'm like, I can't wait to get my hands on some of that. That's so exciting. So guys, definitely check it out. What's the website?
ChasingJustice.org.
Yeah, and you've also got a podcast, so you can really get started and learning and join and get on their mailing list to learn what's going on. That's awesome. Yeah. Any other ways, or people can kind of interact or engage?
Instagram is probably a great way to connect, because we're probably most current on a regular release basis on Instagram.
Oh, good. Doing some Insta Lives and things like that.
Insta Lives, all those things. And obviously podcasting, subscribe to that. The curriculum stuff we should have up in September. And then which everyone's trying to figure this out, like when do we get back into small groups and meeting in person?
Sure.
But we'll probably do cohort programs later this year as well.
Oh, brilliant. And the Reddy family, you guys are heading back in a week or two to Chicago. Hopefully, who knows if school's going to reopen, but I can't wait to get your wife on and to
Yeah,
talk
you're
about some of the
doing one
great
of these with
things.
Vicky. Absolutely need to do that.
Yeah.
Vicky is a champion of justice issues like no other. I love like listening to her and her faith journey and the unpacking of what we talked a little bit about it here. What do we traditionally grow up with, and
Sure.
how do we find our own identity in that? And
Mm-hmm.
that's been very much her journey.
Oh, cool.
She's learning full time in a seminary program in a men's maximum security prison.
Come
That's
on.
pretty incredible.
Isn't
So,
that incredible? Man, we're getting her on. So I said I was just hanging for the low-hanging fruit to get you on first. I'll work my way up to see if I can get Vicky on. But no, honestly, such a pleasure, man, to chat with you. I know I've stolen way more of your time than you had allocated. And I'm just grateful for that, man. I'm cheering you on from all the way back here in Australia. Can't wait to see how things go for you, and look forward to catching up again soon. Make sure you make a trip down the Goldie next time you're back in Australia.
no problem. Hopefully soon. I don't know when we can travel again, but I'd love to see you guys. Love you, brother. I'm excited for this podcast, for the season you've got going on in life. And look, I think God doesn't make mistakes, right? So however we got to where we are, He's going to be using this incredible gift, this time, this offering that you're presenting to do powerful things. So I'll be praying for that.
I appreciate it, man. Hey, God bless you, my friend. Take care and give greetings to the fam.
God bless. Take care.